Welcome back. We've been discussing the relation between music, identity, and social stratification. We have discussed the idea of cultural capital. This concept refers to the sum of abilities, knowledge, and goods one has that are culturally relevant and valuable. We have seen that cultural capital, just like economic capital, is distributed unequally in a society, at least according to Bourdieu. Now let's zoom in on the unequal distribution of cultural capital. Bourdieu refers to the class that possesses an abundant amount of cultural capital as the dominant class. This class has the cultural capital that enables them to produce, decode, and understand works of art and music. For example, they may understand elaborate jazz harmonies, so they can relate to the music of John Coltrane in more than only a spiritual way. Let's now listen to some of Coltrane's music. So, how should we judge this music in a Bourdieuian way? Whether you like or dislike this music will to some extent have to do with whether you have the right cultural capital. Now, the dominant class has what we have called the right codes to produce and decipher encrypted messages in art and music. They are the makers and keepers of high art, according to Bourdieu. Groups that are typically located lower on the social ladder do not hold the same level of cultural capital. They have less know-how with respect to, for example, avant-garde music or abstract art. And because they lack this know-how, Bourdieu argues, they are inclined to accept the judgments of art and music of the dominant class. However, the pernicious part, something Bourdieu calls symbolic violence, is that the underprivileged groups tend to accept these judgments not as judgments of the dominant class, but as natural and universal judgments. For example, judging Bach or Beethoven to be great composers is, according to Bourdieu, a judgment which is made and maintained by the dominant class. However, other groups tend to internalize this judgment as a matter of natural and universal necessity, and in this way, this judgment becomes less a matter of cultural opinion and more a matter of universal fact. It simply becomes the case that Bach and Beethoven are great composers. Now, just to be clear, I'm not making a value judgment about Bach and Beethoven, and Bourdieu is not portraying a conspiracy theory of the elite. The point Bourdieu wants to make is that social contingencies, such as judgments about music of the dominant class, can be perceived as facts of nature, and this is problematic, because it's quite possible to criticize social opinions about music, but it's far more difficult and perhaps even impossible to criticize facts of nature. The consequence of this naturalization of cultural contingencies is that underprivileged groups will not ask questions about the legitimacy of these judgments. If we take the claim Bach is a genius to be natural fact rather than a cultural contingency, it would be quite hard to critically evaluate that claim. And in this way, social inequalities are perpetuated. Being born into a family with an abundance of cultural capital, for example, a lot of Bach, means that one has an abundant opportunities to understand and participate in, let's call it, serious music. This is no guarantee that one will grow up to love Bach, but the dice are at least loaded. Now, on the other hand, being born in a family with limited cultural capital means that one has limited opportunities to understand and participate in serious music. In addition, that person will be more inclined to accept musical judgments from the dominant class and internalize these judgments without critical reflection. Now, this all means that one's musical identity is pretty strongly linked to one's social position. And a last thing I would like to mention is the role Bourdieu attributes to education. According to him, education functions in such a way that it legitimates the class inequalities we described. Children of the dominant class do better in school because they are already tuned to the way the teacher speaks, the way lessons are given, and what the do's and don'ts are in a certain school. Now, this is to say, they do better because of the cultural capital they have and children of underprivileged parts of society lack. Now, notice that cultural capital of children is something they are born into and receive by chance rather than merit. Nobody deserves to be born the son of a king, just like nobody deserves to be born the son of a beggar. However, success in school is seen as the result of individual talent and merit, not as possession of cultural capital, and therefore, for Bourdieu at least, education helps to legitimate and perpetuate inequalities. Pupils who do well are seen to deserve this and vice versa. Thus, the children of the dominant class are crucially advantaged over the children of subordinate classes in that they enter the educational system already well prepared to succeed within it. Now, to be fair, I have to mention that this Bourdieuian association between social stratification and art has been criticized. For example, the concept of cultural capital is open to a lot of interpretation, perhaps too much interpretation, which makes it very hard to use it in sociological research. And in addition, it may be the case that the impact of social stratification is exaggerated by Bourdieu. Especially in our day and age, where a great variety of music is readily available and easily accessible, one can wonder whether social stratification really has the impact Bourdieu attributes to it. But nevertheless, his critique of judgment of taste and social stratification remains an important one and an influential one. So, this brings us to the end of the two-part lecture, where we have discussed the relation between identity, musical judgment, and the structure of society. And this triad nicely illustrates how these three concepts influence one another. In short, one's social position heavily influences one's identity, and one's social position and identity, which are interdependent, in turn influence one's musical judgment. We also discussed Pierre Bourdieu's idea of cultural capital and the way this capital is unequally distributed through the paths of social stratification. And this leads to symbolic violence, which refers to the acceptance of cultural judgments made by the cultural elite by presenting these judgments as natural and universal rather than as cultural and contingent. Now, I do encourage you to do this course's activity because it will stimulate you to put these somewhat theoretical ideas into practice. See you next lesson.